Aloha from Honolulu. Welcome to this hybrid seminar sponsored by the East-West Center Research Speaker Series. This is a recurring program to spotlight emerging developments across the region. Through the series, we explore the environmental, demographic, political, and economic processes that are reshaping the Asia-Pacific region in profound ways. Our topic today, as you probably know, is new dynamics on the Korean Peninsula. Our featured speaker is Rachel Minyoung Lee, who is a POSCO Fellow with East-West Center Honolulu. She is also a Senior Fellow for the Stimson Center's Korea program and the acclaimed 38 North. We have 60 minutes total for our program, so we'll start with a lecture. The remaining time we'll devote to a Q&A session. We'll be able to take questions from both our in-room audience here and the online audience. Lee.
Thank you, Denny, for starting us off. And I would like to start by thanking the East-West Center for giving me this fellowship opportunity and also for giving me the floor to share some of my observations on what's going on with North Korea these days. This has been a special 3 weeks for me in Honolulu, and I'm happy to say that I am now part of the East-West Center community. I hope I am, anyway. Okay, so I think we are all gathered here today to ask these questions. How did we get here, right? Every day we hear about something about North Korea, right? Whether it's missile launches, whether it's North Korea sending weapons or sending troops to Russia, how many soldiers have been killed on the battlefield. So how did we get here, right? In the meantime, diplomacy with the US remains stalemated. We have a new government in South Korea, so what might happen, right? So what does all of this mean? And what might we expect going forward, especially with the new governments in office in the US and in South Korea? So by the end of the session, I hope I'll have given you some better clarity on what Kim Jong Un wants, right? I think that's the ultimate question, is what does he want? You know, why is all of this or any of this happening? So I'd like to start by giving a broad picture of North Korea's foreign policy reorientation, followed by what that means, right? So implications. And then lastly, what we might expect going forward with respect to North Korea relations with the US and with South Korea. Okay, so foreign policy reorientation, I'm gonna take us back to February 2019 and the collapse of the Hanoi summit, because that's really the starting point of all of this. So as you all know, the summit did not go well. There was no deal. And that has had a profound psychological impact on Kim Jong Un. We can tell from the way North Korea handled leadership propaganda in the months that followed. And this resulted in a turn to conservatism across all policies, whether it's domestic policy or foreign policy. And we had Kim Jong Un, of course, after about 6 weeks after the collapse of the Hanoi summit, telling at a party meeting that North Korea was in for a quote unquote long-term confrontation with the US. And that was when he brought back to the fore the concept of self-reliance. So he was hunkering down for a longer term détente with the US. So we have the Hanoi summit and the psychological impact that has had on Kim Jong Un. So that's one thing. Another thing that really fed into North Korea's foreign policy reorientation is the geopolitical landscape, the geopolitical realignments, the intensify US-China competition, and of course, a widening rift between the US and the West and Russia. And also important, I think, to note here is how North Korea started to perceive changing US leadership on the global stage. I think that is very important. I think that based on my review of North Korean propaganda, the disastrous pullout of the US forces from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021 had a big impact on North Korea's decision. I think that was the final nail in the coffin for them, to basically reassess. I mean, it was already going on after Hanoi, but to basically reassess the strategic value of the United States for North Korea. So those two things, the failure of the Hanoi summit and the geopolitical realignments, leading to North Korea really starting to rethink, what does the US mean for us? What can the US do for North Korea? So this takes me then to North Korea's reorientation of US policy. A lot of people will say that, and I agree with them, that the Eighth Party Congress in January 2021 fell just short of North Korea publicly renouncing denuclearization, because you'll recall that North Korea or Kim Jong Un gave a long laundry list of all of these weapons and military capabilities he wanted to develop. They were all about ICBM. A lot of it was ICBMs and nuclear capabilities. So that was a very clear signal, although he didn't state it explicitly that he had no intention of denuclearizing. But he didn't say it, which is important, and I'll come back to that later. So very strong indication in January 2021 at the Party Congress that North Korea really wasn't interested in denuclearizing, right? And then came September 2022, and that was some months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? September 2020, because the Ukraine invasion happened in February 2022. In September 2022, two things happened. North Korea revised the nuclear law, basically laying the groundwork for, or stipulating that North Korea could launch a preemptive nuclear strike, and really broadening the scope of its nuclear strike to include non-nuclear states or states with no nuclear weapons like South Korea and Japan. And also problematic in the sense that it's very subjective, right? The law basically states that if North Korea feels like there is an impending attack, then they have the right to launch a preemptive strike. So what does that mean then? Like, how do you determine that you are under an imminent threat, right? So the broadening of the scope of preemptive nuclear strike and the subjective threshold, or I guess standard for how North Korea determines whether it's under imminent attack. So that was the revision of the nuclear law. And on the next day, or on the same day, in September 2022, Kim Jong Un gave a speech, a very important speech at the parliament, stating that North Korea had drawn a line of no retreat on denuclearization, that its nuclear weapons were not up for bargain. He did say, he didn't say he would never denuclearize. He did say that if our nuclear policy were to change, the world has to change, and the political and military environment in the region has to change. So given North Korea's past statements, what does that mean? A change in the region's political and military environment. It basically means either significantly reducing or pulling out US forces Korea, out of South Korea, no strategic military assets, US military assets in the region, shutting down the UNC. So it's along those lines, is based on past North Korean statements, what we might surmise when North Korea says that there has to be a fundamental change in the region's military and political environment. So that was North Korea basically explicitly saying that denuclearization was off the table. I mean, he didn't say that he would never do it, but given the condition that he put forward, that he attached to possibly denuclearizing, it's a pretty hard condition to meet for the US. So denuclearization, for the first time in public, virtually, North Korea, Kim Jong Un pretty much saying that denuclearization is off the table, that he had never said publicly before. Because the last time before that he had mentioned denuclearization was in 2019 when he said, as long as the US maintains its hostile policy, we will not denuclearize. So you can see the difference in the language. So this spelled, in my opinion, a fundamental change in North Korea's policy toward the US. Because before that, North Korea for more than 30 years had held on to a policy that was basically normalization of relations with the US by working toward denuclearization. Going back to the 1990s, that was the centerpiece of North Korea's foreign policy and policy toward the US. So that speech Kim Jong Un gave at the parliament in September 2022, for me, spelled the end of that policy. At the same time, I'm going to walk us back a little bit to the summer of 2021. North Korea started to show signs of aligning with China and Russia. In the summer of 2021, around the time that they were really, keeping tabs on how the US was pulling out of Afghanistan. And I mentioned earlier that that seemed to have a significant impact on North Korea's foreign policy reorientation. Because for them, it demonstrated a weakening of US power on the global stage. So summer of 2021 is when we started to see the North Korean foreign ministry really starting to side with China and Russia on key foreign policy and international issues in ways that it had never done before. So that would turn out to be one of the earliest signs from North Korea that it was fundamentally shifting its policy toward China and Russia to one of realignment. So how has that changed? Because again, going back to the 1990s, just as Kim Il-sung was gearing up to normal or improve relations with the US, he was also trying to use the US as a buffer against China and Russia. So this policy of non-alignment with China and Russia was also about 30 years old. So we're talking about two fundamental changes here, right? Walking away from the policy of normalizing relations with the US through denuclearization first, and then second, basically going back to the policy of aligning with China and Russia. So that is, I would say, the crux of North Korea's foreign policy reorientation. I would like to note here that we often talk about North Korea's alignment with Russia, whether it's fundamental, when did it begin? It did not begin with Kim Jong Un signing that treaty with Putin in June 2024. We started to see signs again long before that, going back to the summer of 2021, when the North Korean Foreign Ministry really started taking sides with the Chinese and the Russians on key foreign policy issues. So that was one of the first signs that we saw. And then in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, North Korea, the foreign ministry, in 2 or 3 days came out and supported Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That was a quick response from Pyongyang, but not surprising given the fact that they had already started to reorient their policy toward Russia. So it is important to note that North Korea's reorientation of its policy toward Russia did not begin with the signing of the treaty in 2024, did not begin with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I will get to why that's important in just a minute. Actually, now we can start talking about Russia. So realignment with Russia. It is important to note again that the realignment started before the war in Ukraine started, because this should tell us that North Korea started, that this is not just a tactical overnight decision that North Korea made to align itself with Russia. Sure, Russia's invasion of Ukraine expedited North Korea's realignment with and pivot to Russia. However, because that realignment began before the war in Ukraine, I would say that this whole crafting of North Korea's policy toward Russia, the way it was thinking about Russia and its greater foreign policy, was more strategic. It is phenomenal when we think about how North Korea's relationship with Russia evolved in the last 2 or 3 years, right? So starting with North Korea, the North Korean Foreign Ministry quickly recognizing or supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And, we've been hearing for years about North Korea sending weapons and even now dispatching troops to Russia. We could not have imagined this 2 years ago, right? North Korea 2 or 3 years ago, North Korea sending weapons to Russia, much less Kim Jong Un sending his own men to Russia to fight side by side with Russia. The real inflection point for me was in looking back on North Korea's relationship with Russia in July 2023, when North Korea invited a high-level Russian military delegation to take part in North Korea's celebration of the Armistice Day, July 27, 1953, was 2023. That was phenomenal for me because that day was traditionally reserved for celebrating with the Chinese and not the Russians, because without China, it was the Chinese that played that decisive role in preventing North Korea's collapse during the Korean War. It was not the Soviet Union that helped, that played that decisive role. It was the Chinese. So that was why that North Korea had always celebrated that event with the Chinese and not the Russians or the Soviets. So to see Kim Jong Un giving such royal treatment to then Russian Defense Foreign Minister Sergei Shoigu, having meetings with him, having a dinner with him, taking him around to this defense exhibition, showing him these weapons, was just amazing to me. It was shocking. And to see the Chinese delegation getting such cold shoulder treatment. Now, China comes into the picture. And that's why I wanted to cite this example, because we also need to talk about China. What happened between the North Koreans and the Chinese? Why did Kim Jong Un invite a high-level military delegation from Russia? Because it seems kind of ironic, right? Of all of the delegations, inviting the Russian military delegation on an occasion like that for that historical reason that I just cited. Did something start to go wrong between North Korea and China before July 2023? And if so, why? Nobody knows. It's not something you can find in commercially available or open source intelligence, like why Kim Jong Un became angry. He's clearly, something happened that ticked Kim Jong Un off in a major way. We just don't know what that is. We can make speculation, but we don't know for sure. And so that strained relationship between the Chinese and the North Koreans still remains to this day. So going back to North Korea-Russia relations, I digressed a little bit talking about the Chinese. This question often comes up, right, about whether this is a strategic relationship, a longer-term strategic relationship. And by that, most people mean, will this relationship last beyond the war in Ukraine? Or does this relationship just kind of fizzle off after the war ends in Ukraine, or if there's like a ceasefire, right? So is it strategic longer term versus transactional short term? My reading of, at least from the North Korean side, my reading is that North Korea is definitely shooting for a longer term relationship. the way they are going all out on this war, not just by sending troops. I mean, that's one example, but just the way Kim Jong Un meets with the Russians, you know, the words that he uses when he meets with the Russians, the consistent, frequent exchange between the two countries at all levels, starting from the very bottom, you know, with the student union members, you know, going back and forth, all the way to Kim Jong Un having consultations with Sergei Shoigu, who is one of the closest confidants that Putin has. So this is not a short-term relationship that North Korea is just trying to, you know, they're not simply looking at Russia as a buyer, right, of weapons during the war in Ukraine. If that was the case, you know, they don't have to do any of these things because Russia is the one that needs weapons from North Korea right now. They don't have to bend over backwards like this to improve and expand relations with Russia at all levels. The institutionalization, I think, is the important thing here that we have to remember. Why are they doing this? Not only that, but just laying the ideological foundation for this relationship, similar to what the North Koreans have with the Chinese. Shortly after Kim Jong Un came back from the Russian Far East after meeting with Putin in September 2023, he gave a readout before the Politburo, the political bureau of the party, and he said that he said that the Russia-North Korea relationship was built on a foundation of anti-imperialism. So they were going out of their way to give an ideological foundation to the relationship that didn't exist after the collapse of the Soviet Union, similar to what North Korea has with the Chinese, right? They have these party-to-party relations. So you now see North Korea and Russia conducting party-to-party exchange, similar to how the North Koreans are conducting party-to-party exchange with the Chinese. So institutionalization at all levels, from the bottom to the very top, laying the ideological foundation for the two countries. Again, if you are the one with the leverage here being for North Korea, the weapons, they're supplying weapons that Russia desperately needs. North Korea is the one with the troops to give Russia. Russia needs troops. So why is Russia and North Korea doing this? I think they're eyeing something bigger than just cash or wheat, oil shipments that they may be getting from Russia. I think maybe even beyond the military transfers that we hear about from Russia to North Korea. Beyond the war, so this question comes up then naturally, is what does Russia have to give to North Korea? Because we know that there have been many attempts in the past after the collapse of the Soviet Union where the Russians and the North Koreans try to make economic cooperation work, and it never worked. But times have changed, and you know, there's more need on both sides to cooperate with each other. Russia doesn't have as many friends. It's not going to be welcome back in Europe anytime soon. So maybe North Korea is an attractive partner for industrial cooperation that maybe Russia used to conduct with Germany or some other country in Europe. Munitions and defense industries. North Korea has been since exporting weapons to Russia, and with probably money coming in from Russia in return for the weapons and other things, maybe troops. North Korea has really tried to revitalize its munitions and defense industries, probably as a way to not only bolster its own national defense, but also to revitalize the civilian economy, because whatever money they're making on that end probably will have some trickle-down effect on the civilian economy. So is it possible then to think that after the war or ceasefire in Ukraine, that Russia may use North Korea as a weapons production base? Maybe that's something to think about. So I don't think when I say this a lot, the immediate comeback that I get especially from people who look at North Korea-China relations and their trade relations especially as well, but Russia could never replace China as China accounts for as much as 98.3% of North Korea's trade volume. I don't think North Korea is seeking to replace China with Russia. I think North Korea wants to use Russia for different things. So Russia like complementing China, because we know that Putin doesn't care about abiding by sanctions. And he has stated that he's against one-sided sanctions against North Korea. So, North Korea may find Russia useful in the sense that maybe Russia is willing to make some investments in the North Korean economy in ways that the Chinese would not, because as we know, investment is banned. It depends on what kind of investment, but investment in general is banned against under the UN sanctions. So maybe the Russians will, go for something like that. So whatever the Chinese would be reluctant to do for North Korea or with North Korea can probably look to Russia to do with or to get from. So that is how I look at Russia. The other thing too is the treaty. I'd like to talk about the treaty a little bit, the one that was signed last year, June 2024. Article 4 is the best known because it's known as the automatic military intervention clause. I don't think it's automatic because there's stipulation in that clause that could put the brakes on automatic intervention. There's a clause in there about in accordance with the domestic laws of each country, in accordance with UN Charter Article 51. So there are some caveats, so it's not automatic, but it is known as the military intervention clause. There are besides that, other articles that we should pay attention to, such as Article 3, which stipulates negotiations or consultations between the two countries when one country feels like it's under an attack is imminent. So that basically paves the way for early consultations before a conflict begins between the two countries. Article 2 of the treaty, talking about North Korea and Russia joining hands, cooperating, consulting each other on all major regional and global issues. So North Korea and Russia have already started doing that. I think the latest example is when Sergei Shoigu visited Pyongyang in June of this year. That was in the midst of the Israel-Iran conflict. And North Korea, 2 days after Kim Jong Un met with Sergei Shoigu, the North Korea Foreign Ministry issued a statement on Iran, the Middle East conflict. And it was very, very distant and cold toward Iran, which was surprising to me. I think that was a result of Kim Jong Un's reading of Russia's position on the conflict in the Middle East. Because as we know, Russia was reluctant to get too involved. There was a lot of political rhetoric coming out of Moscow, but it didn't really give Iran any help. So I think the foreign ministry statement and the distance it tried to put between itself and Iran was a reflection of Russia's position on the conflict between Israel and Iran and the US. So we see, that's an example of high-level consultations, right? Article 2. So it is already, a lot of these articles are already being implemented and being invoked. Of course, Kim Jong Un says he invoked the treaty to send troops to Russia. So by that, I think he was referring to Article 4, lending military and other forms of assistance when one party comes under attack. Article 7 is another one that's important, interesting, because it paves the way, it leaves the door open for North Korea to possibly join regional multilateral platforms, like the Eurasian Economic Forum, for example, or BRICS, because it says at the request of if one party so wishes, the other party shall help that party that country gain access to international organizations. So I think there's a possibility that North Korea may at some point express an interest or makes an attempt to join one of these multilateral platforms where Russia plays a key role. So as we can see, it's not just about Russia and what Russia can immediately, in the immediate to near term, provide North Korea in terms of cash and military transfers. I think it's all of these other opportunities. And of course, working not just with Russia, but through Russia to gain access to Russia's friends and allies like Belarus. We've seen North Korea stepping up relations with Belarus. And why is this important then? For two things, in my opinion. First, it allows North Korea to reduce its reliance on China economically and for trade. Not replacing China, but anything to reduce its over-reliance on China will help North Korea. And secondly, North Korea's diplomatic footprint, North Korea's diplomatic leverage. I think one major consequence of everything we're seeing right now between North Korea and Russia, North Korea making the headlines, North Korea getting a major international boost, maybe not in a noble way, but basically fighting side by side a major power. Really, we have to think about what that does to North Korea's self-perception, right? The emboldening of Kim Jong Un, the confidence that this gives Kim Jong Un, and how that then might translate into his decisions. Whether that may not lead to more miscalculation or misjudgment on his part. That's a possibility. So North Korea basically wants to be a major player regionally and internationally. And it wants to build a bloc with Russia in this multipolar world, in this multipolar new Cold War world. These are the words of the North Koreans. North Korea, since October 2023, has consistently, at the very highest levels in the foreign ministry statements, Kim Jong Un himself saying, we are going to work with the Russians to build an independent and just global order. So I think that is what North Korea is looking to do. And for all these reasons, I think North Korea is eyeing the bigger prize. I don't think they're in it for the short term. Shifting to China. So North Korea, again, did align with China, but then now, I think now is an interesting question because, again, I mentioned that North Korea's relationship with China remains strained. Again, we don't know what caused it. All we know is that starting in the fall of 2023, at least, September to the fall of 2023, the relationship wasn't going that great. Based on Kim Jong-un's letters to Xi Jinping, very cold and distant. No references to common cause of socialism, we should fight for this. None of that, just very pro forma, very distant letters, right? Last year was a major anniversary year. I think it was the 75th anniversary of the forging of diplomatic relations between North Korea and China. No high-level visits at all. North Korea was doing all of that with Russia instead. So going forward, I do not know what this means. I don't know if this is one of those like vicissitudes that we have so often seen throughout the history of North Korea-China relations, or whether North Korea is recalibrating its policy toward China. And this may sound crazy because the conventional wisdom is, again, how can they do that? China is so important, economically, politically, geostrategically, like how that's never going to happen. I don't know, because I know that a few years ago, many people were skeptical about the notion that North Korea would ever change its policy toward the US. So I think for that same reason, I think we should keep our minds open to the possibility that maybe North Korea could also be reevaluating its policy toward China. In the past few weeks, I have seen signs in North Korean propaganda that it may be interested in improving relations with China. These are maybe one of the first signs that I have seen in a very long time. But these are just some data points. I'm not ready to make an analytic judgment based on these few data points that I have seen. But I think if this pattern holds, then maybe there is no reevaluation of the policy. But I do think that that's a possibility that we should keep in mind. Speaking of reorientation and the possibility or impossibility of fundamentally changing a policy, South Korea is another interesting one. And I would say that what Kim Jong Un has said about South Korea, what it has done to the decades-old unification policy and policy towards South Korea, was shocking in ways that it was not when Kim Jong Un fundamentally shifted the country's policy toward the US or went back to aligning with the Russians and the Chinese. Much more shocking because this is a cultural thing. It's embedded in every North Korean's blood, in their mindset. They're programmed from the moment they're born that unification is the ultimate goal. So it's kind of like, telling Koreans to, that kimchi is banned from this day on, right? It's embedded in you. So how, the fact that, and again, this is like the Russia policy, right? This didn't happen overnight. Kim Jong Un first talked about it, announced it in December 2023, but this writing was on the wall going back to as early as the fall of 2019. We have seen signs very consistently that North Korea was rethinking its policy towards South Korea. So the policy itself was developed on it was a strategic change. The implementation, however, seems difficult because North Korea doesn't want to talk about how it's changed the constitution, for example, to reflect Kim Jong Un's new to Korea's policy. We know that they revised the constitution in October 2024 to reflect his new to Korea's policy, but all we know is that North Korea defines now South Korea in the constitution as a completely hostile state. That's all we know, but we haven't really gotten any other details. So something tells me that there are sensitivities, a lot of sensitivities. And I think it's because of the shock among the people in North Korea. I think that's one reason. The other reason could be that North Korea wants to keep us all surprised. Like they want us to be in for a big surprise. Because if they revise the constitution to define DPRK borders, and that was one of Kim Jong Un's instructions, that he wanted that stipulated in the constitution, then that could have bigger repercussions. And maybe he doesn't want us to know that yet for whatever reason. So having said all of this, where do we go from here? North Korea and the US, North Korea and South Korea, given the geopolitical alignments and the fact that North Korea is getting so much out of Russia, and the fact that North Korea can keep its economy afloat, by using the Russian money, by the easing or with the help of the Russians, sending people to work or violating sanctions in other ways. The cryptocurrency theft, of course, is another huge revenue for the North Koreans. Why should North Korea want to change anything? The status quo. What can the U.S. give North Korea that it's not already getting? I am skeptical that it's truly interested in ending the war, or that it even cares about recognition as a nuclear state. I think it would be nice for North Korea to get those things, but at the moment, I don't know that he genuinely is interested in those things. Like he may be interested, but are those things enough to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table? At this point in time, I'm skeptical. And South Korea is in a much worse position because North Korea was burned last time Kim Jong Un was burned. He took then President Moon Jae-in's advice about Yongbyon being enough for a deal with Trump. It turned out to be not the case. So there's a lot of mistrust between North Korea and South Korea, well, especially on North Korea's part. And North Korea knows that there's a limit to how much the South Koreans can actually do for North Korea. There's talk right now in South Korea about resuming tours to Mount Kumgang. President Moon Jae-in back in 2018, 2019 tried that before. He tried very hard to get that started, to get the Kaesong industrial complex going. And I think he got Kim Jong-un's hopes up, but Kim Jong-un saw firsthand that that didn't work then. Why should it work now? So prospects for inter-Korean relations also very dark, even with the change in South Korea's administration to a progressive administration. However, that is not to say that there's never any room for engagement between the two Koreas going forward in the future. I think if there is a business opportunity for North Korea, Kim Jong-un may be open to inter-Korean cooperation, but not in the same way that things were done before, not as a compatriot, but as a separate state to another separate state, is my reading. And I'll leave it at that and be happy to answer any questions you have.
Yeah, we'll start our Q&A session now. If you're in the room and you're asking a question, please remember to activate your microphone so that the red light comes on, and then pressing again to turn it off when you're finished. If you're online and you want to ask a question, look at near the bottom of your screen, you'll see a box that says Q&A. You click on that, a dialog box will open, and you type your question in there and send it in. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the rest of the time available. First question comes from online, and it is picking up on the last point you made. Do you think that the two Koreas will ever reunify? And under what circumstances, how far into the future? What's your prediction?
I think it's questions like these. That's a very good question, but I think it's questions like these that prompted Kim Jong-un to declare his two Koreas policy, because I don't think he wants to unify. I think that Kim Jong-un thought that unification was impossible anyway. So why don't we just why don't we just cut to the chase, right? Why do we keep pretending that this is going to happen? And, I think he also wanted to nip that possibility or hope in the bud, right? Among his people. I think another reason why he decided to go with the two Koreas policy is because he sees South Korea as an impediment in any future nuclear negotiations going forward. I think he wants those negotiations without South Korea at the table. In the past, was there ever a time when North Korea wanted to improve relations with the US, wanted to have nuclear negotiations with the US, and South Korea was not involved? North Korea wants to basically exclude South Korea, sideline it completely. I think that's one of the reasons. So my short answer is unfortunately, I don't think that's a realistic goal.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. You mentioned that in the last couple of weeks, you've been seeing signs coming out of the DPRK that they're open to closer alignment or rebuilding the PRC relationship. Have you been seeing any response from the PRC side that indicates that they might be open to this as well?
I think based on the media reports that I have seen, that China was eager to maintain good relations with North Korea for a while, even when North Korea was becoming sour, but then that they sort of gave up. That's a very interesting question, because I don't know where this is coming from. So I don't know if North Korea is the one that wants to improve relations with China, if it's China initiated, or if it's out of mutual interest. And if so, like, why? I'm sorry, I'm asking more questions than you asked, but it's a complex question with noisy answers.
What kind of relationship does North Korea have with Iran, if any?
Well, everything is pretty clandestine, right? DPRK-Iran relations are very difficult for an open source intelligence analyst because there's nothing of use really in at least in North Korean propaganda. We know that they've been cooperating on missiles going back to the 1980s. Any exchange, cooperation that may be going on between the two countries is not reported by North Korean media. So it's very hard to say anything beyond that connection, the missile connection. But I would say that I don't know if I can say this now. Now that just given the way Russia treated Iran during the latest conflict, but I would have said a few months ago that maybe through Russia, North Korea might have wanted to further boost its relations with Iran on the weapons side, sort of as to export weapons and technology.
Yes.
Hi, Dennis Saleh, Consul for Germany in Hawaii. I was wondering if you have any more insights on the arms exchange between North Korea and Russia, flow from North Korea to Russia, personnel and arms, and reverse. Do you know anything about arms going to North Korea?
I am sorry to say, but I have to be honest, nothing beyond what's been reported in the media. Because based on open source, and that's what I do, like open source intelligence, at least in North Korean media, they don't talk about that, and we don't expect them to talk about that, given the sensitivities.
From online, what kind of risks are there for North Korea in sending troops to aid Russia in fighting in Ukraine?
I think the benefits far outweigh the costs, and I think that's why North Korea keeps sending them. I mean, the obvious downside is that your men are killed or wounded. There have been some reports about these soldiers becoming exposed to outside culture. I don't think North Korea is too worried about that part. I don't know how much exposure they could have on the battleground, to be honest. That would be harmful to North Korea. And we all know that once you've been outside, when you go back to North Korea, you're sent to a re-education camp for a few weeks or a few months. The benefits, I think, have been reported widely by the media, but I think one of the biggest benefits for North Korea, aside from the cash that Kim Jong Un may be making, is modern warfare, exposure to modern warfare, for these commanders and soldiers to see from on the ground how drones are operated, for example, how the war is fought. That, quite frankly, is way more than what South Korea has at the moment.
To follow up with that, you suggested two possible ways of the North Korea might look at the troops who have gained experience. One is that they're an asset, one is that they're a liability, right? The asset would mean they've got experience, they can become trainers to future troops, how to deal with drones and so on. Liability is they've been exposed, as you say. Which do you think would govern how the government would deal with these folks?
Well, the ones that make it back out alive, I think like on the superficial side of things, I think that they would be treated as heroes and martyrs. Kim Jong Un has already said that they're heroes. So I think they will get lavish treatment. But I also think that they will have to go through, undergo some kind of a re-education program as they've been outside. One other thing that I forgot to mention on the benefit side of things is the modernization of the military. I think North Korea is learning lessons from the war in Ukraine, because North Korea, Kim Jong Un has consistently been talking, he's consistently talking about modernizing the military, modernizing the way they fight. And that coincides with North Korea sending troops to Russia. So that's another concern, I think, that we have to keep in mind.
Okay, so I had a question about what may Russia want from the DPRK. So we're hearing a lot about what DPRK wants from Russia, what they're initiating the higher level consultations. And so, like, what do you see Russia doing from their side in the future? Do you see the relationship escalating from their side, giving more support to North Korea, or do you see the North Korea reaching out more initiations from North Korea's side as they advance their long-term goal?
So I don't know I don't think anybody knows exactly what they have agreed on, right? Because it's all closed doors. So we can only speculate and make our best educated guesses. I think, so we kind of know what we think we know what North Korea may want from the Russians. The bigger question is, what do the Russians want from the North Koreans after the war, right? Which is not as obvious. I think the most obvious one, though, is the post-war construction efforts. They'll definitely need North Korea's manpower for that, and North Korea has already started sending troops, right? Builders, builders, to the reconstruction sites. The second one, I think, and this is something I mentioned earlier, is the possible industrial cooperation. Given the lack of complementarity between the two economies, this may be difficult, but I think maybe munitions and defense industries may be like a lower hanging fruit, especially if Russia wanted to use North Korea sort of as a weapons production base. Because even after the war in Ukraine is over, I don't think Russia's arsenals will be teeming with weapons, right? They'll need to fill them up. So, where are they going to get those weapons? Russia's going to need North Korea's help for a while. So I have to think, if we're thinking this long term, is there some kind of industrial cooperation? Just putting aside the trade and the joint, ventures aside, is there industrial cooperation in the picture? I have heard from a Russia analyst who's based in Europe that the way Russia talks about North Korea now has changed completely from a few years ago. And that basically Russian media are portraying North Korea as this like modern, like industrialized country, really playing up the industrial side of North Korea. And so this Russia analyst was speculating that Russia was basically could be laying the groundwork for some type of industrial cooperation with the North Koreans even after the war is over.
Next question. What is the likelihood of North Korea supporting Russia in Russia's dispute over the island territories with Japan, the Kuril Islands? I think we can broaden this out to ask the question, does North Korea sending actual military forces to help Russia in a conflict open the door to either helping the other in other conflicts outside of Ukraine?
I think it is a possibility. I think North Korea is going to think longer and harder, about sending troops in a Russia-Japan conflict, given that it's just right behind its, right in its backyard. But I wouldn't rule that out. I wouldn't rule that out. I think this also begs the question then of, North Korea's role in a Taiwan Strait conflict, right? Cross-strait conflict. Do we take it for granted that North Korea is going to take China's side? I think China would definitely need North Korea's help. I don't know if we should take that for granted. Just given where the relationship has been going and given what I've said about North Korea possibly reevaluating its relationship with China.
Charles?
As I understand, one of the problems in Hanoi was that Kim Jong Un thought he could make a little deal based on Yongbyon. And the Americans said, no, you need a comprehensive deal, including the enriched uranium, centrifuges, and so forth. So that broke down. But there are some people today who think that a little deal is still a possibility. And I wondered what your view of that is, looking both at the North Korean side, but also maybe at other parties.
Thank you for that question. I think that's off the table. The small deal, Yongbyon for other things. I think North Korea has stated officially that was off the table, and that it was going to take a lot more for a deal. Anything that has denuclearization on the agenda, I don't think is going to work. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to look at some kind of an arms control deal where, it's like a phased approach where North Korea gives up something and the US or South Korea gives up something. So it's going to have to be that maybe risk reduction, but denuclearization, even as a far off ultimate goal, I don't think is going to fly with North Korea anymore.
Sure.
What if the deal is something like this? And I don't think the US would accept this, but North Korea rejoins the NPT, but as a recognized nuclear state.
I don't see North Korea accepting that because it has no reason to. It doesn't get anything from it. Because as far as North Korea is concerned, it's a nuclear state. You know, it's codified into the constitution. It is something of a nuisance, I think, now for North Korea to have to deal with bypass all these sanctions, right? So if North Korea could be legitimized as a nuclear weapon state, then it wouldn't have to do any of that. So it's less time, less money to get your products into the country, you know, exporting. But I think it's just that at this point. I think it's a nuisance. I don't think North Korea is interested in having the sanctions lifted. I mean, it wouldn't be the core of any negotiations, which I think goes back to to whether North Korea would be interested in that kind of a deal, because it does have a bearing on sanctions being lifted. I think the other interesting question, though, is, you know, since you raised NPT, is whether the U.S. president cares about the NPT. Maybe that's another discussion, but yeah, because I'm thinking what could the U.S. government offer, and I guess I'm just asking if President Trump is interested enough in the NPT to make that one of the conditions for North Korea, you know, like North Korea rejoining the NPT.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left. Next question. What do you think the North Koreans think about what's happened to President Yoon in South Korea? I guess both the declaration of martial law and him being removed from office.
I think they were probably shocked, just like the rest of us. It is hard to tell because North Korea was very, very reserved this time around about reporting on Yoon's declaration of martial law and the political fallout that ended up in his being impeached. I don't think it, I think it has to do with the two Koreas policy. I think that's a major reason as to why they've been reticent to talk about it. What's been more interesting to me is that they haven't commented on all of these stories coming out of Seoul about South Korea sending the drones into Pyongyang in October 2024, when they could have really had a field day with that one and could really be using that to raise tensions, but they're not doing that.
We have one more question from in the room. Yes, Laura.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting as always. I just had a question going back to relations with the US and the denuclearization, maybe building on. I do agree that to start engagement with denuclearization on the table right now would be impossible. However, I wonder, why would you think that when Kim Jong Un said, the world has to change for us to take denuclearization into consideration again, you say that you interpret that as some sort of US withdrawal from the region. And my first instinct, because in other periods of detente with the US in 2018, they had stated that they would have no problems with US troops, for example, on the peninsula, as they needed a balance force with China, with whom they have this love-hate relationship. So my first instinct was to read that as a reiteration of their point that hostile relationships have to change before they consider the denuclearization, rather than an indication of actual US presence. So I was wondering, like, why would you read that kind of in that key instead?
So I have heard from those who've been involved in private negotiations with North Koreans, and including Kim Jong Un himself, reportedly said that North Korea would like to see the USFK remain in South Korea for that balance, and to act as a buffer, as you mentioned. In the official statements, however, their demand had always been like, we want USFK out, right? We want the UNC closing down. In fact, that's one of the reasons why some people in South Korea were very reluctant and concerned about all this talk about peace, end of war declaration in 2021, because if you declare the end of the war, then what need is there from North Korea's point of view for USFK to remain in South Korea if there's no war? So my assessment was really based on my reading of North Korean statements, official statements, but I realize that narrative is there in the private channels. Thank you.
We're out of time. Thanks to our speaker, and thanks to all of you, both our virtual audience and our in-room audience. This presentation will be recorded and posted on the East West Center YouTube channel and also the East West Center website, like all of our webinars. And check our website for information about upcoming webinars. Until then, hui ho.